What if everything you've heard about Noah's Ark is only half the story? Not a fairy tale, not a myth wrapped in silence, but a desperate, dangerous construction project built against laughter, doubt, and a world that refused to listen. Imagine a man cutting the first piece of wood for a storm no one believed would come, a family risking everything while society watched and mocked. How was the Ark really built? What engineering secrets kept it alive through unimaginable chaos? And what terrifying truth forced humanity to start over? Stay with me, because the real story begins long before the first drop of rain fell. We'll explain everything in this video step by step. Don't skip it. Before the hammer struck the first plank, before the animals gathered two by two, there was a man standing alone against the noise of a restless world. The earth was loud then, crowded with ambition, violence, and forgetfulness. Cities grew, but hearts shrank. People built towers to their own glory, yet ignored the quiet warnings carried on the wind. And in the middle of that, chaos walked Noah. Not a king, not a warrior, not a man chasing fame, just a builder, a listener, a man who carried a burden heavier than wood or nails, the responsibility to believe when no one else would. He was given a task that sounded impossible: build a vessel for a storm no one had ever seen. And so began one of humanity's oldest stories, not merely about a flood, but about patience, engineering, faith, and the endurance of the human spirit. Part 1, The Blueprint of Hope. The Ark was not imagined as a small boat drifting aimlessly on water. Ancient descriptions portray a massive structure, long, wide, and tall enough to dwarf the homes and markets of Noah's generation. Building it was not an act of magic, it was labor. Relentless, exhausting, physical labor. Picture the early mornings, fog resting on the ground, tools laid out on rough earth, hands blistered from the day before. Wood had to be cut, shaped, and hauled. Pitch had to be prepared to seal the walls against water that had never yet fallen. Every measurement mattered. Every beam carried risk. Neighbors laughed. Some mocked. Others whispered that Noah had lost his mind. Yet the sound of their laughter mixed with another sound, the rhythm of tools striking wood, a quiet, stubborn rhythm that refused to stop. The Ark was more than a construction project. It was a declaration that preparation is an act of courage. Part 2, the people behind the planks. Noah did not build alone. His family worked beside him, sons learning patience through repetition, daughters-in-law managing supplies, cooking meals, tending to the small daily details that make great projects possible. They were not heroes in shining armor. They were ordinary people, tired, uncertain, sometimes afraid. Imagine the long evenings when doubts crept in. Conversations whispered under flickering firelight. What if the storm never comes? What if we are wrong? What if everyone else is right? Yet each morning they returned to work, because belief is rarely loud. It is quiet persistence, showing up again when yesterday brought only ridicule. And slowly, piece by piece, the Ark rose from the ground, a monument not to perfection, but to perseverance. Part 3, engineering against the unknown. The Ark had to survive conditions no builder had ever faced. It required balance, wide enough to resist tipping, strong enough to carry weight beyond imagination. Ventilation had to be planned for living creatures. Storage had to be organized for food, water, and survival. There were no previous disasters to study, no textbooks, no experienced shipbuilders guiding the process. Everything was built for an unknown future. The structure's design, long and box-like, suggests stability over speed. It was not meant to sail across oceans or conquer waves. It was meant to endure, to float, to outlast chaos. This was engineering driven by survival rather than ambition. Part 4, The Gathering. As the Ark neared completion, something strange began to happen. Animals gathered, quietly, unexpectedly. Creatures that normally avoided each other moved in uneasy harmony. For the family inside the Ark, preparation shifted from construction to organization. Pens were built, feeding routines created, space divided carefully. Outside, the sky darkened. The first raindrops fell like questions. People who once laughed began to look upward with unease. Thunder rolled not as a distant rumor, but as an approaching truth. And then came the flood. Part 5, life inside the Ark. Inside, survival became a daily discipline, feeding animals, cleaning spaces, managing fear, listening to storms rage outside while wondering if the structure would hold. There were no windows to escape the noise, no guarantees of tomorrow. Just creaking wood, pounding rain, and the endless motion of water. Yet, within that floating world, something remarkable grew. resilience. The Ark became a fragile sanctuary carrying not only life, but memory, culture, and hope that humanity could begin again with humility. Part 6, After the Waters. When the storms faded and the waters receded, the Ark rested on solid ground. The door opened to a world washed clean, silent, unfamiliar, both beautiful and terrifying. Survival was not the end of the story. Rebuilding was. The people who stepped out carried scars of isolation and loss, but also lessons carved into their bones. That preparation matters, that courage is often lonely, that survival is a collective act. Closing, the real legacy of the Ark. The true story of Noah's Ark is not only about a flood or a vessel of wood, it is about humanity standing at the edge of uncertainty and choosing to build anyway. It reminds us that history is shaped not only by warriors and rulers, but by builders, by those who prepare for storms long before the first drop of rain. The Ark stands as a symbol of endurance, of engineering born from faith, and of families who carried hope across the darkest waters. And perhaps the greatest lesson is this: every generation faces its own rising storms. Every generation must decide whether to ignore the warnings or to begin building, patiently, quietly, faithfully, even when the world laughs. Because sometimes the greatest act of courage is simply to start building the Ark. The world Noah lived in did not collapse overnight. It unraveled slowly, almost quietly at first, like a thread being pulled from an old garment. People woke each morning to the same rising sun, walked through the same crowded streets, and carried on with their trades, their arguments, their celebrations. Markets were loud with bargaining voices. Musicians played in public squares, and families gathered around evening fires telling stories of their ancestors. On the surface, it looked like a thriving civilization, a place bursting with energy and confidence. Yet beneath that noise lay a deep restlessness, a growing distance between people and the values that once held their communities together. Violence had become common enough that many barely noticed it anymore. Disputes once settled through conversation now ended in threats or bloodshed. The powerful took more than they needed, and the weak learned to stay silent to survive. Justice was spoken of often but practiced rarely. Leaders made promises to protect the people, yet their attention drifted toward wealth and influence. The old wisdom, respect for neighbors, care for the land, humility before forces greater than oneself, began to feel outdated in a culture that celebrated strength and ambition above all else. Children grew up in a world where cruelty was normalized. They watched adults compete relentlessly, measured success by how much one could accumulate, and learned that compassion was often mistaken for weakness. Teachers tried to pass down ancient lessons of balance and responsibility, but their voices were drowned out by the excitement of progress and expansion. New buildings rose quickly, symbols of human achievement and pride, but they were built on shaky foundations, both physically and morally. Craftsmen rushed their work to meet demand, merchants cut corners to maximize profit, and trust between strangers slowly eroded. Nature itself began to feel unpredictable. Seasons shifted in ways elders struggled to explain. Rivers that once flowed steadily grew erratic, sometimes shrinking to a trickle, sometimes flooding unexpectedly. Farmers noticed subtle changes in the soil, harvests becoming less reliable. Some saw these shifts as warnings, signs that something larger was out of balance, but most dismissed them as temporary inconveniences. After all, humanity believed it had mastered the world around it. Why fear forces that had always been manageable before? Amid this growing chaos walked Noah, observing what others had learned to ignore. He saw how neighbors stopped helping one another during hard times, how disputes escalated into cycles of revenge, how laughter in the streets sometimes masked deep insecurity. He noticed how people avoided quiet reflection, filling every moment with noise so they would not have to confront uncomfortable truths. Conversations that once revolved around community needs now focused on personal gain. Even moments meant for gratitude were overshadowed by competition. People around Noah were not villains in their own minds. Many believed they were simply adapting to survive in a harsher world. Merchants justified their dishonesty by pointing to rivals who did worse. Warriors defended aggression as necessary protection. Leaders claimed that harsh decisions were required for stability. Small compromises accumulated until they formed a culture where integrity became rare. Those who questioned the direction of society were labeled naive or out of touch. Festivals still filled the calendar, but their spirit had changed. Instead of celebrations of unity and harvest, they became displays of wealth and power. The loudest voices dominated gatherings, leaving little space for quiet wisdom. Performances grew more extravagant, drawing crowds eager for distraction. Entertainment replaced reflection. People cheered for spectacles that emphasized strength and conquest, reinforcing the belief that survival belonged only to the boldest and most ruthless. Rumors circulated of individuals who claimed to hear warnings. Visions of coming hardship, whispers that the earth itself was groaning under human carelessness. These voices were often dismissed or ridiculed. Skepticism turned into mockery. Crowds gathered not to listen but to laugh, reinforcing a shared belief that nothing could truly threaten their way of life. After all, disasters happened to other places, other generations. The present felt too strong, too advanced, too certain to crumble. Families struggled quietly behind closed doors. Parents worried about the future their children would inherit. Sensing that something was wrong but unsure how to change the course of an entire culture, some attempted to hold on to old values, teaching kindness and restraint, but their efforts often felt like small candles against a growing storm. Friendships became transactional, alliances shifting based on convenience rather than loyalty. People guarded their resources, fearing scarcity even during times of abundance, as technology and craftsmanship advanced. Society became increasingly confident in its own abilities. Massive structures were built to showcase human ingenuity, towering above landscapes that once inspired humility. These monuments became symbols of dominance over nature rather than partnership with it. Pride replaced gratitude. The belief spread that humanity could overcome any challenge through sheer determination and clever design, leaving little room for caution or reverence. Religious rituals continued, but many participated out of habit rather than sincere reflection. Ceremonies that once encouraged self-examination turned into performances meant to impress others. Words of devotion were spoken loudly, yet daily actions often contradicted those declarations. Hypocrisy became so common that people stopped expecting authenticity from one another. Trust weakened further, replaced by suspicion and competition. In quieter corners of the world, some individuals still felt uneasy, sensing a looming shift they could not fully articulate. They noticed how quickly anger spread through crowds, how rumors ignited conflicts, how small disagreements escalated into widespread violence. Elders recalled stories of ancient floods and disasters, cautionary tales meant to remind humanity of its vulnerability. Yet younger generations, raised in an era of apparent prosperity, struggled to imagine such events happening again. Weather patterns grew more intense, storms arriving with unusual force. Lightning split ancient trees, winds tore through settlements, and sudden downpours flooded fields. Many interpreted these events as isolated anomalies rather than signs of a larger change. Builders reinforced walls, merchants adjusted trade routes, and life continued with only minor adjustments. Few paused long enough to ask whether these disturbances pointed to a deeper imbalance. Communities once bound by shared purpose began to fracture along lines of wealth, power, and ideology. The rich withdrew into fortified homes, while the poor crowded into vulnerable areas. Resentment simmered beneath the surface, occasionally erupting into open conflict. Law enforcement grew harsher, attempting to maintain order through fear rather than trust. Public debates became spectacles of accusation rather than opportunities for solutions. Through all of this, warnings existed not only in words, but in the quiet unease felt by many hearts. People sensed that their world was drifting away from something essential, yet confronting that truth required humility few were willing to embrace. It was easier to laugh at cautionary voices, easier to drown concern in celebration, easier to believe that tomorrow would always look like today. The decision to begin building did not arrive with applause or certainty. It arrived quietly, like a weight placed gently on Noah's shoulders, heavy enough to change the course of his life. The instructions felt impossible at first. Construct a massive vessel for a storm no one else believed would come. The very idea clashed with everything his neighbors understood about the world. Rain in such overwhelming force had never been seen, and the thought of preparing for it felt like surrendering to madness in the eyes of others. Noah wrestled with doubt long before the first piece of wood was cut. He walked through the familiar streets, listening to people laugh, watching merchants conduct business as usual, noticing how ordinary life continued untouched by the warnings that had shaken him to his core. He wondered whether silence would be easier, whether it would be safer to blend into the crowd and abandon the burden he carried. The temptatio and to remain comfortable lingered in every interaction, in every casual greeting from neighbors who expected him to live as they did. When he finally began gathering materials, the reactions were immediate. Curious onlookers asked questions at first, their voices filled with amusement rather than concern. They treated the early stages of construction like a novelty, a strange project that provided entertainment during long afternoons. Children gathered to watch him work, mimicking his movements with sticks and laughing at the scale of the task. Some adults offered sarcastic encouragement, joking about the invisible sea that would soon arrive. Each strike of the hammer echoed louder than the last, not because of the sound itself, but because of the growing attention it attracted. The structure began to rise slowly, its outline forming against the horizon in a way that could no longer be ignored. With visibility came criticism. Friends who once shared meals with Noah began keeping their distance, unsure how to reconcile their respect for him with the embarrassment they felt on his behalf. Relatives questioned his sanity, urging him to reconsider before he ruined his reputation completely. Courage in that environment was not dramatic or heroic in appearance. It was repetitive, exhausting, and lonely. Noah woke before dawn each day, knowing that his efforts would be watched and judged. He worked through heat and fatigue, carrying beams that strained his muscles and tested his resolve. Every measurement required precision, every joint demanded patience, and every delay brought fresh waves of mockery from those convinced that failure was inevitable. The ridicule grew sharper as the ark's size became undeniable. What began as light teasing transformed into public humiliation. Crowds gathered not out of curiosity, but to challenge him directly, shouting questions meant to expose the absurdity of his mission. Some accused him of arrogance, claiming he believed himself wiser than the rest of society. Others insisted he was motivated by fear, too weak to accept that the world was stable and secure. Noah's family felt the pressure as intensely as he did. They endured whispers when they went to markets, noticed doors closing more quickly when they approached gatherings, and sensed the unspoken judgment hanging over every conversation. Their loyalty required daily renewal. There were moments when exhaustion and isolation threatened to fracture their unity, when arguments flared over the cost of continuing a project that offered no visible reward. Yet they returned to the work site each morning, choosing solidarity over comfort. The physical labor itself demanded unwavering focus. Trees had to be selected carefully, felled with precision, and transported across difficult terrain. Planks were shaped by hand, their surfaces smoothed through hours of repetitive motion. Pitch had to be heated and applied to seal the wood against water that existed only in imagination. Every step carried risk, from injuries caused by heavy tools to the possibility of structural collapse if calculations were wrong. Doubt was not an occasional visitor, it was a constant companion. There were nights when Noah lay awake, replaying the day's insults in his mind, wondering whether perseverance was courage or stubbornness. He watched the stars and searched for reassurance, and they are silent patterns. He observed the calm sky and questioned whether he had misinterpreted the warning he believed he had received. The absence of immediate evidence made faith feel fragile. Despite that internal struggle, small moments of affirmation appeared unexpectedly. A beam that fit perfectly after hours of adjustment. A day when the family worked in quiet harmony, each person anticipating the needs of the others. A stranger who paused long enough to ask sincere questions rather than offer ridicule. These moments did not erase the difficulty, but they provided enough strength to continue one step at a time. As construction progressed, the ark became more than a physical structure. It turned into a visible symbol of resistance against collective denial. Its presence forced people to confront a question they preferred to avoid. What if the warnings were real? Instead of engaging with that possibility, many doubled down on their mockery. They exaggerated stories about Noah's supposed delusions, turning him into a cautionary tale about abandoning reason. Seasons changed, bringing scorching heat and chilling winds that tested both the builders and the materials they used. Progress slowed during harsh weather, increasing frustration among family members who already felt stretched beyond their limits. Supplies ran low at times, requiring long journeys to gather additional resources while maintaining the existing structure. Every setback amplified the voices of critics who insisted the project would never be completed. Yet the ark continued to grow, plank by plank, level by level. The repetitive rhythm of construction created its own form of resilience. Muscles adapted. Oh, the strain. Hands developed calluses that reduced the sting of splinters, and minds learned to focus on immediate tasks rather than overwhelming doubts about the future. Work became a form of meditation, a daily practice that anchored the builders in purpose even when external validation was absent. Neighbors who once ignored the project began to feel uneasy as the vessel's size eclipsed nearby buildings. Its shadow stretched across the ground during late afternoons, a constant reminder of the possibility they refused to acknowledge. Some avoided walking near it altogether, as if proximity might force them to reconsider their assumptions. Others approached with thinly veiled hostility, demanding explanations that could satisfy their skepticism. Through it all, courage manifested not as certainty, but as persistence. It meant continuing to measure, cut, and assemble despite the absence of applause. It meant facing crowds that ridiculed the effort and returning to the same worksite the next morning without bitterness. It meant carrying the weight of responsibility while accepting that understanding might never come from those watching from a distance. The ark's frame rose higher, its scale challenging even the builders who had envisioned it from the beginning. Standing beneath its beams, Noah felt both awe and apprehension, aware that each completed section brought him closer to a future no one else could yet see. The sound of tools striking wood echoed across the landscape, blending with the murmurs of spectators and the quiet determination of a family choosing faith over acceptance. The work of building the ark was never carried by one pair of hands alone. It was a family's labor, a shared burden that shaped their days and tested their relationships in ways they had never imagined. Each morning began before the sun rose fully over the horizon. The air was cool and heavy with anticipation as Noah's sons gathered tools worn smooth from constant use. Their movements were no longer awkward or uncertain. Repetition had turned effort into rhythm. They carried beams together, learning to trust one another's strength and timing, adjusting their pace so that no one stumbled under the weight. Conversations during those early hours were quiet and practical. Measurements were checked aloud, plans discussed in low voices, and tasks divided according to skill and endurance. One son learned how to carve joints with precision, shaping wood so perfectly that the pieces fit together without gaps. Another became skilled at organizing materials, ensuring that nothing was wasted and that supplies were always within reach. Their roles were not assigned by rank, but discovered through trial and patience. Mistakes were common at first: crooked cuts, misaligned beams, and small arguments sparked by exhaustion. But over time, they developed a silent understanding that made their work more fluid. The daughters-in-law played an equally vital role, though their contributions were often less visible from a distance. They managed the daily rhythm that allowed the builders to keep going. Food had to be prepared in large quantities to sustain the intense physical labor. Water needed to be carried and stored safely. Injuries, splinters, bruises, strained muscles required constant care. They organized supplies with remarkable efficiency, turning chaos into order so that the construction site remained functional. Their presence reminded everyone that survival was not only about building walls, but also about maintaining the health and morale of the people behind them. Meals became moments of fragile peace. The family gathered around simple food, hands still trembling from hours of work. They shared stories from their childhoods, laughed at small mishaps from the day, and sometimes sat in silence, too tired to speak. These pauses allowed tension to release, even if only briefly. The sound of laughter felt almost rebellious in a world that mocked their efforts. Yet those shared moments created bonds stronger than any wooden beam, reinforcing the sense that they were not facing the burden alone. Fatigue often brought out hidden fears. As the sun set and shadows lengthened, doubts surfaced more easily. Some evenings were filled with quiet worry. Questions about whether the ark would ever be completed, whether the sacrifices they were making would be worth the cost. The younger members of the family sometimes wondered what life would have been like if they had chosen comfort instead of this demanding path. Arguments flared when exhaustion stripped away patience, but reconciliation came just as quickly, fueled by the understanding that division would only make the task harder. Training and learning happened continuously. Skills were passed from one person to another without formal instruction. One son who mastered a technique would teach the others, demonstrating with steady hands and encouraging them through early failures. The daughters-in-law learned to manage supplies with precision, creating systems that ensured tools were returned to the same place each evening. Over time, their collective knowledge grew into something larger than any single person's expertise. The ark became a classroom where persistence was the primary teacher. Weather presented constant challenges. On scorching days, sweat soaked their clothing and blurred their vision as they worked under the relentless sun. They wrapped cloth around their heads and drank water sparingly, aware that supplies were limited. During colder seasons, stiff fingers struggled to grip tools, and breath formed clouds in the air as they continued shaping wood. Rainstorms occasionally forced them to halt construction, giving them unexpected moments of rest, but also increasing anxiety about delays. Each season required adjustments to their routines, teaching flexibility alongside endurance. Social isolation deepened the family's reliance on one another. Neighbors who once visited freely now avoided them, uncomfortable with the scale of the project and the controversy surrounding it. Invitations to gatherings grew rare. Markets became tense places where whispers followed their movements. Instead of seeking acceptance from the outside world, the family turned inward, creating their own culture of mutual support. They celebrated small milestones, completing a section of the hull, solving a difficult engineering problem, or simply finishing a long week without injury. Children within the extended household observed everything with curious eyes. They watched adults struggle and persist, absorbing lessons about resilience without formal lectures. They learned to carry smaller tools, to sweep debris, and to assist in simple tasks. Their questions often sparked deeper conversations about purpose and courage. The adults answered honestly, acknowledging fear while emphasizing the importance of preparation. Through these interactions, the next generation became part of the project's emotional foundation. The repetitive nature of labor transformed their perception of time. Days blended into one another, marked not by calendars, but by progress on the structure. The rising frame of the ark provided visible proof of their collective effort. Each completed beam represented hours of cooperation, compromise, and trust. Standing together to admire a newly finished section became a ritual that reinforced their shared identity as builders and survivors. Emotional support proved just as crucial as physical strength. When one family member struggled with doubt, others offered reassurance, reminding them of the progress already made. Quiet gestures, placing a hand on a tired shoulder, offering water without being asked, sharing a wordless smile, helped maintain morale during the most difficult moments. They learned to recognize signs of burnout in one another and adjusted workloads accordingly, preventing small injuries or emotional strain from becoming larger crises. Their work fostered a deep sense of humility. No single person could claim full credit for any part of the ark. Every plank required multiple hands. Every decision involved discussion and compromise. Leadership emerged through service rather than authority, with individuals stepping forward when their skills were needed and stepping back when others were better suited for a task. This fluid dynamic allowed the family to function as a cohesive unit despite the immense pressure surrounding them. As the ark grew larger, the complexity of their coordination increased. Timelines had to be managed carefully to prevent sections from being completed out of order. Materials were inventoried regularly to avoid shortages. Communication became more structured, with daily meetings to review progress and plan the next steps. These practices reflected not only practical necessity, but also a deepening understanding that endurance required organization as much as strength. Their shared labor reshaped their relationships in lasting ways. They learned each other's strengths and vulnerabilities with a depth that ordinary life rarely reveals. Trust developed not through words, but through consistent action, showing up each day ready to contribute despite fatigue and uncertainty. The ark stood as a physical testament to their cooperation, but the true structure being built was the invisible network of loyalty, sacrifice, and resilience that held the family together. Through relentless days of work and nights filled with whispered worries and quiet determination that refused to fade even as muscles ached and hands trembled under the weight of another beam waiting to be lifted into place as dawn approached once more with the promise of another day shaped by effort and shared endurance. Designing the ark required thinking beyond every known rule of construction. There were no shipyards nearby filled with experienced sailors offering advice, no scrolls describing vessels built to withstand endless waves, no tradition of building something meant to float for months on uncertain waters. The challenge was not only to create a structure large enough to carry living creatures and supply, but to ensure that it could endure forces no one had ever measured. Every decision was made in a landscape of uncertainty, where mistakes could not simply be repaired once the floodwaters arrived. The first challenge was stability. A narrow vessel might travel quickly across water, but speed was not the goal. The ark needed to remain upright during violent storms, resisting the chaos of waves crashing from every direction. Its broad base was carefully measured, each beam positioned to distribute weight evenly. Builders tested sections repeatedly, pushing and rocking the framework to simulate movement. They learned to think like the water itself, imagining how currents might shift beneath the structure and how wind might press against its walls. Material selection demanded patience and foresight. Wood had to be strong enough to resist rot and flexible enough to bend without breaking under pressure. Each tree chosen for construction was examined carefully, its grain studied for weaknesses. Cutting and shaping took days for a single beam, and rushing the process risked structural failure. Workers developed techniques to join planks tightly using wooden pegs and layered seams to prevent gaps. They understood that even the smallest crack could become a path for water once the storm began. Sealing the ark presented another engineering puzzle. Pitch was heated and applied between layers of wood, creating a barrier meant to repel moisture. The process was messy and dangerous, involving thick smoke and the risk of burns. Workers coated surfaces again and again, checking for imperfections by pouring small amounts of water over completed sections. Each test forced them to confront the possibility of failure, encouraging them to refine their methods until confidence replaced guesswork. Weight distribution became an ongoing concern as plans expanded. The ark would carry animals of different sizes, stores of food, containers of water, and the tools necessary for survival. Shelving and compartments were built to keep heavy items low, preventing imbalance during rough seas. Ramps and internal walkways were designed to allow movement without creating sudden shifts in weight. Every addition required recalculating how the vessel might respond to motion, leading to constant revisions and adjustments. Ventilation posed a unique challenge. A sealed structure might keep water out, but would trap heat and stale air inside. Builders experimented with openings along the upper sections, protected by overhangs that allowed airflow while preventing rain from pouring directly inside. They considered how animals would generate heat and moisture, how human occupants would need fresh air to maintain strength and clarity of mind. The placement of windows and vents required careful balance between exposure and protection. Light was another concern. Without adequate illumination, daily tasks would become nearly impossible once the ark was closed. Narrow openings were positioned to capture daylight without compromising structural integrity. Interior spaces were arranged to reflect and distribute whatever light entered, reducing reliance on fire, which posed its own risks in a wooden structure. The interplay between darkness and visibility influenced the design of corridors, storage areas, and living quarters. Waste management became a critical element of survival. Landing. Animals required space not only to stand and rest, but also to be cleaned regularly. Sloped flooring and drainage channels were incorporated into lower decks, allowing waste to be moved efficiently. Tools for cleaning were stored strategically to minimize the distance workers needed to travel during storms. This aspect of engineering demanded a practical understanding of daily life rather than grand architectural ambition. Food storage required foresight into preservation. Grain bins were sealed tightly to prevent moisture and pests from destroying supplies. Shelving systems allowed easy access while keeping provisions secure during sudden movements. Drying racks were installed near ventilated areas, ensuring that food remained usable over long periods. Water containers were secured with ropes and supports to prevent them from tipping or breaking. Internal organization mirrored the logic of survival rather than comfort. Narrow passageways connected different sections of the ark, designed to maximize space while allowing caretakers to move quickly between animal enclosures. Pens were arranged to separate species that might pose risks to one another, while still maintaining balance across the structure. Builders tested the flow of movement repeatedly, walking through imagined scenarios where storms required rapid responses. The ark's outer form reflected simplicity over elegance. Its box-like shape reduced the risk of capsizing, prioritizing buoyancy and durability. Curves were minimized to make construction more manageable and to prevent weak points along the hull. Reinforcing beams were added in layers, creating a skeletal framework capable of absorbing shocks from waves. The vessel was not meant to conquer the sea, but to endure it, to remain afloat rather than to travel swiftly. Testing and adaptation became part of the daily routine. Sections of the hull were exposed to heavy weights and simulated pressure. Builders filled small basins with water to observe how treated wood reacted over time. Every experiment revealed new challenges: warping caused by temperature changes, joints that loosened under repeated stress, coatings that required additional layers. Solutions were rarely immediate, forcing the team to embrace a process of continuous improvement. Weather influenced design choices in unexpected ways. Strong winds during construction highlighted areas that required additional reinforcement. Sudden storms exposed weaknesses in temporary coverings, leading to innovations in drainage and water redirection. Observing natural forces provided insight into how the ark might behave once fully afloat, guiding adjustments that improved resilience. Communication between builders became more technical as the project advanced. Measurements were discussed with increasing precision, and sketches evolved into more detailed plans. Team members learned to visualize three-dimensional structures in their minds, predicting how each component would interact with others. Collaboration replaced individual guesswork, turning the ark into a collective achievement shaped by shared understanding. The psychological aspect of engineering also played a role. Builders needed confidence in the vessel they were creating, especially when facing ridicule from outsiders. Each successful test strengthened their belief in the design, transforming abstract teach into tangible evidence. Standing inside completed sections, they could feel the strength of reinforced walls and imagine how the ark would respond to the pressure of rising waters. As the structure neared completion, final inspections focused on details that might have been overlooked earlier: loose pegs, uneven surfaces, areas where pitch had thinned. Workers moved slowly through each level, listening for creaks and testing the firmness of every support. The ark's immense scale made this process exhausting, requiring days of careful review and repeated adjustments as new concerns emerged and solutions demanded further innovation in the endless pursuit of a vessel capable of surviving forces beyond imagination, while carrying the fragile hope of continuity through storms no one could fully predict or control. As preparations continued with tools in hand and eyes fixed on the ever-growing complexity of a structure built not for conquest but for endurance against the unknown forces waiting beyond the horizon, where dark clouds gathered and winds began to whisper through unfinished corridors and along freshly sealed planks still warm from the hands that shaped them. Silence followed the storm in a way no one inside the ark had ever experienced before. For months, they had listened to relentless rain striking the wooden roof, waves crashing against reinforced walls, and the restless sounds of animals reacting to the endless motion beneath their feet. When the noise finally faded, the absence of it felt almost unsettling. The air seemed heavier with stillness, and every creak of the vessel echoed with a different meaning. People moved cautiously, unsure whether the quiet signal adds safety or simply a brief pause before another wave of chaos. The first signs of change appeared gradually. The ark no longer rocked violently. Instead, it drifted with a slower, more predictable motion. Light filtering through the upper openings looked brighter, reflecting off waters that were no longer churning with fury. Those inside began to notice subtle differences: the way their steps felt more stable, the way animals grew calmer, the way conversations became less strained. Hope entered quietly, carried on the realization that survival might extend beyond mere endurance into the possibility of beginning again. Opening the door required courage equal to building the ark itself. The outside world had become an unknown landscape, reshaped by forces beyond human control. When the door finally moved, fresh air rushed inside with unfamiliar scents: wet earth, broken vegetation, and the faint promise of new growth. The light was almost overwhelming after months of filtered shadows. People shielded their eyes as they stepped forward, uncertain whether the ground would hold firm beneath their feet. The world they encountered was both beautiful and devastating. Hills and valleys appeared transformed, stripped of familiar landmarks that once guided travel and memory. Trees lay uprooted, their roots exposed like silent witnesses to the storm's power. Rivers carved new paths through the land, leaving behind channels that glistened under the sun. The sky seemed wider, its clarity almost shocking after months spent beneath wooden beams and dim openings. Every step carried the weight of loss, reminding survivors that the past had been washed away along with the floodwaters. Animals were released carefully, one group at a time, their movements cautious at first. Creatures that had shared confined spaces now spread into open fields, testing their freedom with tentative steps. Some ran immediately, disappearing into distant hills, while others lingered near the ark as if unsure whether safety existed beyond its walls. Watching them leave brought a mix of relief and sadness, as the bonds formed during months of care dissolved into the natural order of the world. Rebuilding began not with grand structures, but with simple tasks necessary for survival. Shelter had to be created quickly to protect against changing weather. Fires were lit for warmth and cooking, their smoke rising into a sky that seemed endless compared to the confined space of the Ark. Tools that had once shaped the vessel were repurposed to clear land, gather materials, and create the first signs of a new settlement. Each action felt both familiar and entirely new, shaped by lessons learned during the long journey. Food sources needed to be established carefully. Seeds preserved during the voyage were planted into soil that felt different beneath their hands, softer and enriched by the flood's remnants. Hunting and gathering required exploration of unfamiliar terrain, forcing survivors to learn the rhythms of a transformed environment. Water sources were tested cautiously to ensure safety, and storage systems developed during the Ark's construction proved invaluable in organizing supplies. Emotional recovery unfolded alongside physical rebuilding. Survivors carried memories of the storm's violence, the constant fear that the Ark might fail, and the grief of knowing that many lives and cultures had been lost. Conversations around evening fires often drifted toward reflection, sharing stories of the past not as a way to cling to what had vanished, but as a means of honoring it. Laughter returned slowly, hesitant at first, then growing stronger as people rediscovered moments of joy in simple successes. The Ark itself remained a powerful presence on the landscape. Its massive form served as a reminder of both survival and responsibility. Some returned to it regularly, walking through empty corridors that once echoed with animal sounds and human activity. The structure became a place of memory, where lessons about preparation, cooperation, and humility were silently preserved within its walls. Children explored its decks with curiosity, asking questions about the storm and the journey that had carried their families through unimaginable danger. Community dynamics shifted as survivors recognized the fragility of their new beginning. Decisions were made collectively, drawing on the cooperative practices developed during months of shared labor. Resources were distributed carefully to avoid conflict, and tasks rotated to prevent exhaustion. Leadership emerged through experience rather than authority, with individuals stepping forward when their skills were needed and stepping back to allow others to contribute. The sense of unity forged within the Ark continued to shape their interactions on land. Nature revealed signs of renewal in small, unexpected ways. Fresh shoots pushed through damp soil, birds returned to nest among broken branches, and insects buzzed around pools of water left by receding floods. These details offered reassurance that life was resilient, capable of emerging even after catastrophic change. Survivors observed these patterns closely, learning from the environment as they adapted to their new surroundings. Cultural practices evolved as people reflected on the lessons of their survival. Rituals focused on gratitude and remembrance replaced older celebrations rooted in excess and competition. Stories told to younger generations emphasized humility and respect for the natural world, reinforcing the understanding that humanity's strength lay not in domination, but in cooperation and preparation. Art and music emerged as ways to process grief and express hope, transforming pain into creativity. Challenges persisted despite the promise of renewal. Weather remained unpredictable, requiring constant vigilance. Food shortages threatened during early seasons before crops matured fully. Conflicts arose as individuals struggled with trauma and differing visions for the future. Yet the resilience developed during the Ark's construction and survival provided a foundation for addressing these difficulties. People remembered the strength that came from working together, from trusting one another even when fear threatened to divide them. Over time, new traditions formed around the memory of the flood. Annual gatherings honored the journey, recounting stories of courage and cooperation to ensure that the lessons would not fade with passing generations. Symbols carved into stone and wood depicted the Ark not as a monument to glory, but as a reminder of responsibility. The community embraced the idea that survival carried an obligation to build a more balanced and compassionate world, one shaped by awareness of vulnerability and respect for the forces that had reshaped their lives as they continued planting seeds, raising shelters, sharing stories beneath open skies, watching the horizon with both caution and hope, while footsteps marked new paths across soil, still carrying the echoes of a storm that had forever altered the rhythm of human history, and the fragile promise of renewal carried forward by hands that once clung to wooden beams, now reaching into the unknown future with determination shaped by memory and quiet resilience that guided every action taken under the vast expanse of a sky that no longer felt distant but intimately connected to the choices they made each day as they moved steadily through the ongoing process of rebuilding life from the remnants of a world transformed beyond recognition, while learning to balance gratitude with responsibility in every small decision that shaped the fragile beginning of a new chapter in human existence. Thanks for watching this video, and Don T. Forget to like and sub, Cribs.